town of Harvey. You ever been out that way on US 52? You remember there was like the big inflatable gorilla out there in front of a farm? That was my grandpa's farm. Yeah. Grandpa had an odd sense of humor. He had a mailbox for airmail that was 10 feet off the ground. Yeah. And he had that good German accent that because he grew up in a family where he only spoke German. So I always thought Henry Kissinger was trying to make, sound like my grandpa. Well, I want to talk today about something that I think needs to be addressed in the church. Since last October, we've seen some really horrific images and video that's come out of the Middle East. When last October 7th hit, I woke up. Sharon usually gets up several hours before I do each morning. She goes to bed real early, gets up real early. That way we each have like our alone time on either end of the day. Both of us we would live our lives inside our heads if we could. It's not a good way to, it's like hiding your light under a basket, so we push ourselves to get out. But we are both introverts, which surprises people. For some reason, standing in front of a group and talking is fine. Talking to people one-on-one, like, I did outside sales for 3 years. That was the hardest job I ever had because I had to go into guys' offices and like, This is like me when I was in first grade and I'd come home from school every day to tell my mom what I'd learned that day. Mom, guess what? God bless her, she always let me tell her what. So this is me, grown-up me, telling you, guess what? Anyway, Sharon got up that morning, and ahead of me, and when I got up, she had I-24 News on, which is an Israeli news channel with English language programming. And she said, "You got to watch this." And so we watched the horror of October 7th unfold. The world sympathized with Israel for a little while. And then, since then, has turned back on Israel. And now it's all Benjamin Netanyahu's fault that there's no ceasefire deal. As if Netanyahu could compel Hamas, Hezbollah, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, or Iran to do anything. On top of which, and we can maybe talk about this later, the idea that Benjamin Netanyahu has an iron grip on the government of Israel is just as ridiculous as thinking that Donald Trump could tell the government of the United States what to do when he was president. Israel has a deep state, and the insiders there don't like Netanyahu. Our friend Avi Lipkin tells us because Netanyahu was educated in the United States, the insiders in Israel consider him an outsider. Avi says Israel is 60% conservative, 20% socialist, 20% Arab. The socialists were the ones who immigrated there first, descendants of the ones who immigrated first. They control the levers of power, the judiciary and the military. You cannot become a pilot in the IAF if you're not a socialist. You cannot become a high-ranking general if you're not a socialist. And forget about becoming a judge, much less making the Supreme Court, if you're not a socialist. Netanyahu is not a socialist. So those who are only told Bibi what they thought he needed to know prior to October 7th. Hamas is deterred. So file that away as important information. Standing with Israel right now as an American Christian is not always a popular thing to do, because a lot of mainline Christians, a lot of liberal Christians who get their news from corporate media outlets are convinced that Israel is the aggressor here. And especially when you've got generations of kids who've been indoctrinated by Marxist professors in college, where the whole world is broken down into oppressor and oppressed. Israel is relatively rich, so they must be the oppressors. The Arabs are poor, and therefore they must be the oppressed. Therefore, Israel is bad. That's the logic behind this strain of thought. So there are Christians out there who will argue with people like me, and I presume like you, who believe that we should stand with Israel, and that Israel's return to the land in 1948 was what God prophesied through the Hebrew prophets. Amen. 25, 26, 2,700 years ago. Israel returns to the land in 1948. Who could have foreseen that coming? Oh, well, God. But there are Christians today saying, no, this is not the real Israel. It's fake Israel. These are not real Jews, they're fake Jews. This Israel was created by the Rothschilds, those evil bankers, or the Freemasons, or the Illuminati. And the Jews aren't even real Jews. Have you heard this theory, the Khazarians? The Khazarian Mafia? It's a belief that the Jews of Israel, primarily Ashkenazi, and in truth only about 35% of Israeli Jews are Ashkenazi, European Jews, as compared to Sephardic Jews who come from Spain, that the Ashkenazi Jews are actually Turkic, descendants of a kingdom in the Middle Ages that fell apart in the 13th century, the Khazarians. The truth is that the royal family, the ruling family of Khazar, converted to Judaism. Now, why would they do that around the year 800 AD? Because they were a buffer state between the Byzantine or Eastern Roman Empire, which was Christian, and the Islamic state, the various empires that followed Islam. So they were caught between Christians on one side and Islam on the other. And to maintain a degree of independence, apparently, the ruling house of Khazar decided, we'll become Jews. And that way we can be friends to both sides. And of course, that didn't work out too well. As buffer states always find, whether you're like Ukraine today, caught between NATO and Russia or whatever, being a buffer state is never a good place to be. So the theory goes that when the Khazarian kingdom fell in the 13th century, they fled to Europe where they became the Jews that are in Israel today. So therefore, the Jews of Israel aren't real Jews, as though you've got to have a genetic bloodline connection to be a Jew. I mean, Jesus had Moabite and Canaanite blood in his bloodline. Does that mean Jesus is not a Jew? No, it's ridiculous. The fact is that the Khazarian theory is rejected by historians. There's no historical basis. Nobody knows if anyone other than the royal house of Khazar became a Jew. And DNA testing. DNA testing disproves it. And yet it persists. They're not the... So, bottom line is, all of these conspiracy theories, the Rothschilds, the Illuminati, the Khazars, whatever, they happen not to be true. There is, however, a hidden history behind the return of Israel to the land. And that's what I'm going to talk about today. And the reason the history is hidden is that because for many of the players involved, prominent men in the United Kingdom and the United States, they would prefer it remain secret because it's highly embarrassing. And I'll explain why as we go along. The seeds of modern Zionism. How did the modern Zionist movement come to be? Why did a group of European, Russian Jews decide we need to gather together and form our own country? It began with a series of events in the 19th century. And we're going to do another one of these nifty little historical slideshows here. These are just a number of events, of anti-Jewish events that took place in Europe and in the United States in the 19th century. I had to cut down the list because we could be here the rest of the afternoon if I just went through them all. In 1805, in Algeria, between 200 and 500 Algerian Jews were massacred. In 1815, the Jewish ghetto in Rome was reestablished by Pope Pius VII. Now, I thought the ghetto was invented, the Jewish ghettos were invented by the Nazis in World War II. It happens not to be the case. It was actually an invention of the Vatican in Rome. Now, under Napoleon, who conquered Italy in the early 19th century, between 1808 and 1815, Jews had been allowed to leave the ghettos, to work wherever they wanted. They didn't have to be home before dark. There was no quarantine. There was no, what's the word I'm looking for, at night when you have to be home at a certain hour. Curfew, thank you. Curfew was the word I was looking for. There was no curfew under Napoleon, but after 1815, Napoleon was no longer in power. He was defeated. The ghetto was reinstituted by the Pope. Jews had to be back in the ghetto before sundown when the doors were closed and locked. You did not want to be a Jew caught outside the ghetto after curfew. 1819, a series of anti-Jewish riots began in Germany that then spread to Denmark, Latvia, and Bohemia. This was an August through October of 1819. These were called the Hep riots. Now, there's some dispute as to what the name, how the name is derived. Hep. Some think it's the traditional cry of German shepherds, not the dogs, but the actual Germans who shepherded sheep. Hep, get the sheep going where they want to go. But there are some who think it's an acronym from Latin. Hierusalima est perdita. Jerusalem is lost. This was the cry of the rioters in 1819. It is very possibly where we get the words for the cheer, hip, hip, hooray. The Hep riots of 1819. 1827, Russia began compulsory military service for Jewish boys, some of them conscripted as young as the age of 8. Those conscripts were sometimes forcibly encouraged to be baptized. Jumped ahead. 1830, Jews in Persia. There we go. Jews in Persia attacked and forced to convert to Islam. 1834, in what was then Ottoman Palestine, Arabs and Druze in the northern part of the country, northwest of the Sea of Galilee, a community called Safed. The town was there was rioting and the town was looted by Arabs and Druze. Druze is kind of an offshoot of Islam. They venerate Moses' father-in-law, Jethro. Interestingly, the Druze beliefs are kind of secretive. They don't really let people know what they believe. But generally speaking, today, the Druze are very faithful members of the Israeli state. They serve in the military. They're good Israeli citizens. But the Druze are scattered between Lebanon, northern Israel, and Syria. In 1834, they were rebelling against the Ottoman overlords. They looted and rioted the Jewish community of Safed for a period of 33 days. In 1840, the so-called Damascus Affair, Jews were accused of murdering a Christian monk and his Muslim servant and using their blood to bake matzah. This is the so-called blood libel that has been leveled against Jews for centuries. They kill Christian children and use the blood to bake their matzah. It's not true. It's never been true. But again, this led to an outbreak of violence against the Jews of Damascus in 1840, which until fairly recently in history, Damascus had a very large Jewish population. In 1844, Karl Marx, yes, that Karl Marx, published a piece called On the Jewish Question. Jews had been trying to achieve emancipation in Russia. They didn't want to live under the special rules that had been imposed on them by the Russian government. Marx wrote, quote, "What is the worldly cult of the Jew? Huckstering. What is his worldly god? Money. Money is the jealous God of Israel, besides which no other God may exist. The God of the Jews has been secularized and has become the God of this world. In the final analysis, the emancipation of the Jews is the emancipation of mankind from Judaism." In other words, anti-Semitism, anti-Jewish beliefs are literally Marxist. 1850, Richard Wagner, Flight of the Valkyries. He wrote an essay titled Jewishness in Music. He attacked Jews in general and the composers Giacomo Meyerbeer and Felix Mendelssohn in particular, Wagner arguing that Jews had infiltrated the music industry, not through their artistic abilities, but because of their control over financial resources. Does that sound familiar? Yes, Jews are behind the entertainment industry today, we are told. Well, this was 1850, Richard Wagner. What's really interesting is that Mendelssohn, who was born Jewish, was later baptized as a Christian, and he wrote a beautiful oratorio called Elijah. Sharon listens to that again and again. And it's a great oratorio to listen to if you want to memorize Scripture, because it's all in there. He just basically took Scripture to tell the story of Elijah versus the prophets of Baal. Beautiful music, wonderfully performed, and a great way to memorize Scripture. And Wagner was taking him to task simply because he had been born to a Jewish family that converted. 1862, here in the United States, General Ulysses S. Grant issued General Order Number 11, ordering all Jews out of his military district. This was parts of Tennessee, Mississippi, and Kentucky. Grant's father came to him with a couple of merchants from Cincinnati, Jewish fellows, who were wanting to get a cut of the illicit trade in cotton. You see, there was an embargo on Confederate cotton, which was really putting the hurt on a lot of economies around the world. The British depended on Southern cotton. The Europeans, a lot of Northerners depended on Southern cotton. And suddenly, the Southerners weren't allowed to sell it, except there was a lot of black market trade in the cotton. So General Grant's father, hey, my boy, he'll cut us a deal. Well, Ulysses was incensed, threw his dad and his buddies out of the office, but then he went and kicked all the Jews out of his territory as well. Or at least he ordered it. When the word got out, members of Congress raised a stink. President Lincoln forced him to rescind the order and made him apologize as well. 1864, the Moroccan cities of Marrakesh and Fez, 500 Jews massacred. 1871, Pope Pius IX said this in regard to Jews, quote, "Of these dogs, there are too many of them at present in Rome, and we hear them howling in the streets, and they are disturbing us in all places," end quote. Pope Pius IX. 1878, a German preacher and politician, Adolf Stecker, founded the German Social Party, or the Christian Social Party, which was the beginning of the political anti-Semitic movement in Germany. It did not begin with the National Socialist Party of Adolf Hitler. Stecker was the court chaplain of Kaiser Wilhelm I, grandfather of the Kaiser during World War I. So this was not some random guy at a small country church. He actually had some influence in Germany. 1881 through 1884, things got really bad in Russia for Jews. The pogroms began, large-scale targeted anti-Jewish riots. More than 200 anti-Jewish events, most notably in Kiev if you're Russian, Warsaw, Odessa. These were triggered by the assassination of Tsar Alexander II. Alexander II was killed. There was a conspiracy, 18 people arrested. One of the conspirators, a woman, was accused of having Jewish ancestry. And so because of that, the Jews were blamed. 200 riots in big cities like Warsaw, Kiev, and Odessa. Interestingly, this was at a time when my German ancestors, who eventually wound up here in North Dakota, were living in the vicinity of Odessa. Had no idea from the family history how this affected them, if at all. If they knew about it, don't know. But they were nearby when this was going on.
Have you done the DNA? A lot of our Germans from Russia are Jewish.
Yeah, I have not. And it's because I don't want my DNA in the hands of a company who's going to turn around and sell it to other companies. Well, to whoever. Yeah. Anyway.
One of the speakers yesterday is a Jew, and she didn't know that, and so she had the DNA then, and her grandparents came over in the 30s, and they didn't tell anybody.
Yeah. Yeah. So anyway, my ancestors were at least in that region when this stuff was going on. 1882, Alexander II's successor, Tsar Alexander III, enacted a series of temporary laws. Whenever a government enacts a temporary law, it never stays temporary. Like our income tax, which was supposed to be temporary for World War I. Anyway, these laws were systematic discrimination against Jews. According to one of his advisors, the laws were meant, and I quote now, to cause 1/3 of the Jews to emigrate, 1/3 to accept baptism, and 1/3 to starve. This is why Jews began fleeing Russia in droves in the late 19th century. 1891, 20,000 Jews just expelled from Moscow altogether. In fact, there were so many leaving and they had no place to go, so they decided to go to Ottoman Palestine, where they were buying land at highly inflated prices. Muslim leaders in Jerusalem asked the Ottoman authorities in Istanbul to stop letting Jews enter the country, or that region. It was not a separate country, I should say. Stop the entry of Jews from Russia. The Jews wanted to get away from the Tsars. The Ottomans were letting them in because, hey, we're making money selling them land. But the Muslims did not appreciate that. Then in 1894, there came an event that Sharon's done a lot of research on, and she's working this into her Red Wing Saga series, the Dreyfus Affair. A Jewish artillery officer in the French military, Captain Alfred Dreyfus, was falsely convicted of treason. He was convicted of spying for Germany, and he spent 5 years in prison on Devil's Island off the coast of French Guiana, off the coast of South America. It had finally emerged after he'd spent 5 years at hard labor that the real culprit was a French army major named Esterhazy. But instead of this exculpatory evidence freeing Dreyfus, French military higher-ups covered up the evidence, and they acquitted the case against Esterhazy in 2 days and then brought new charges against the Jewish officer Dreyfus. In 1899, a new trial resulted in another conviction and an additional 10 years on his sentence. But then they pardoned him. It's like, okay, you're guilty, but hey, because we're nice guys, we'll let you go. In 1906, finally, he was exonerated. And here's the remarkable thing. Dreyfus went back into the French military, served through World War I, and he retired from the military as a major in the 1930s. Remarkable. The reason this is important is because it was this story that opened the eyes of a man named Theodor Herzl. Theodor Herzl is the father of modern Zionism. He was a journalist in the 19th century, an educated, multilingual Jew. He thought, look, we're assimilated. We're Europeans. We're French. We're German. We're Austrian, whatever. He thought when he covered the trial of Dreyfus that Dreyfus was guilty. And later, when it came out that Dreyfus had been framed and sent to prison wrongly, Herzl was like, it really doesn't matter how hard we try to assimilate. They're going to blame the Jew. We need to protect ourselves because being good citizens is not going to protect us. It is clear that being good Frenchmen or Germans or Austrians or Poles or Russians will not protect us. So he formed the first Zionist organization and called the First Zionist Congress in 1897. This was in Switzerland, Basel, Switzerland, August 29th to 31st, 1897. He promoted Jewish immigration to Palestine, and he tried to get support of wealthy Jews in European countries. He made very little progress. He went to the Rothschilds, who had branches of the family invested in banking in Germany, in Austria, in France, in England. They didn't like him. He didn't like them. The Rothschilds had very little to do with him, except for Baron Edmund Rothschild of France. He funded some Jewish settlements in Palestine, a couple of towns to this day that were basically founded with the money that Edmund Rothschild provided. But Edmund never moved to Palestine. It's like, I got a pretty sweet gig going here in France. Here, I'll send money, you guys go do it. But as far as the other Rothschilds, very little assistance from any of the Rothschild family. Baron Albert Rothschild of the Austrian banking family, nothing to do. Nothing to do, not with Herzl, but with Jews in general. It's like, again, I got mine, you go get yours. In fact, the same is true of a lot of very wealthy Jews who had assimilated into American society in the 19th century. Some of them were very high-ranking government officials. In fact, the Secretary of State for the Confederacy was a Jewish man named Judah Benjamin. But these Jews who were coming over from Eastern Europe and from Russia, getting away from the pogroms of Russia, they're poor, they don't speak English, their customs are weird. The Jews of America weren't very helpful to the people trying to get away from the oppression that the discrimination they were facing in Eastern Europe and in Russia at that time either. Herzl went to Pope Pius X, went to the Vatican for support, thinking, look, we share some of the same scriptures. There are prophecies in there about the return of Israel to the land. Maybe it'll help us. Pope Pius X refused and told Herzl that because the Jews refused to recognize Jesus, that the Roman Catholic Church could therefore could not recognize the Jews. Sorry, you put them on the cross, we'll have nothing to do with you. Herzl died in 1904. He didn't see his dream realized. He was so desperate to get his people a homeland where they could come together and protect themselves that he actually was willing to accept an offer from the British government in the early 20th century, the British government said, hey, look, we can't do anything for you in Palestine, but how about Uganda? It was a British colony then. We'll give you land in Uganda. And Herzl was like, okay. And the Jews who had come together in the Zionist Congress, who they were calling Herzl king, they turned on him on a dime. They didn't want to go to Uganda. It was Palestine or nothing. Well, Herzl died young at 1904, but the World Zionist Organization continues to this day. Now, the interesting part of the history of the founding of Israel, again, the critics of Israel like to contend that Israel stole the land from the Arabs. This happens not to be the case. Again, the early settlers there, the late 19th century, fleeing Russia, they were buying land, and again, generally at inflated prices from absentee owners. There were a number of promises that were made to Jews and to Arabs, beginning around the time of World War I, because the Ottoman Empire was falling apart. The Ottomans, the Turks, had control of the Holy Land for about 4 centuries at that point. They'd conquered it around the time that they took Constantinople in the 16th century, the 15th century. But the Ottoman Empire was falling apart. And so, in fact, it was referred to by other European government officials as the sick man of Europe. I mentioned yesterday that's one of the reasons the Palestine Exploration Fund of the UK was sending archaeologists over to Palestine was to kind of scout the area out for the Foreign Office. Yes, they were doing great archaeology, but they were also reporting back on where the guns were and stuff, where the Ottomans had their military outposts and so forth. The promises that were made by European powers to both Jews and Arabs, 1915 and 1916, the British High Commissioner in Egypt, a man named Lieutenant Colonel Sir Henry McMahon, wrote some letters back and forth with the Sharif of Mecca, whose name was Hussein bin Ali. McMahon promised that the United Kingdom would recognize Arab independence in a large area after World War I. 1915, the world was at war. The Ottomans were on the side of the Germans and the Austrians, which means the Brits, the French, the Italians, the Russians, to a point, even the Japanese. Japanese were allies in World War I. I'd forgotten that. But the British, the French, the Italians were looking at the Ottomans, and the vast territory that they held from the Mediterranean Sea to Mesopotamia was all under Ottoman control. And to get the Arabs to rebel against the Turks, the Brits behind the scenes were saying, look, if you guys rise up against the Turks, we'll guarantee you independence. There will be independent Arab homeland. Okay. The Arab goal out of all this was an independent Arab state from Aleppo, which is northern Syria, to Aden, which is Yemen, below Saudi Arabia. Basically everything from the Persian Gulf, the Gulf of Aden, the Indian Ocean, to the border with Turkey. They saw that as an independent Arab state. Sharif Hussein was a very ambitious guy. 1916, you may have heard of the Sykes-Picot Agreement. You heard of that? Sykes-Picot Agreement, 1916. This was a secret treaty between the British and the French. This was used to divide up Mesopotamia. After the war, the French, you'll get this part north, the Brits will get everything else. France would control southeastern Turkey, Syria, Lebanon, the Kurdish regions up there. The UK got what is today southern Israel, Palestine, Jordan, southern Iraq, and then a small area around the ports of Haifa and Acre in Israel. The rest would be an international zone. In 1917, there was a letter from the French foreign minister to a man named Nahum Sokolov. Sokolov was essentially the successor to Theodor Herzl. Talk more about him in a little bit. The Cambon letter, June 4th, 1917, basically said the French government, which entered this present war to defend a people wrongly attacked, and which continues the struggle to assure the victory of right over might, can but feel sympathy for your cause. In other words, the Zionist cause. The triumph of which is bound up with that of the Allies. I'm happy to give you herewith such assurance. In other words, the French were saying, when we win the war, we'll make sure that there is an independent Jewish homeland. This preceded the very famous Balfour Declaration. In fact, it cleared the way for the Balfour Declaration November 2nd of 1917, because the Brits, they're not going to be outdone by these French, so they came back with their own declaration. This is one of the reasons the Rothschilds are accused of creating the State of Israel. Lord Balfour, Foreign Secretary for the British government, wrote a declaration which he delivered to Lord Rothschild, who was a leader of the Jewish community in Britain, promising a national home for the Jews. Now, notice some weasel language here. A national home, not the national home, not an independent Jewish state. Very cleverly, carefully worded diplomatic language which gave them room to negotiate and to weasel out as they did, as you will see in the upcoming slides. There is some evidence that the British government issued this declaration because they thought it would help persuade the American government to come into the war on the British side, because in November of 1917, the U.S. was still not committed to the war. They wanted the U.S. in fully because they knew we had the numbers, the manpower, and the industry to turn the tide of World War I against Germany and the Austrians and so forth. The war had been at a stalemate. If you've done any reading about World War I, you see it was a slaughter, a mindless slaughter. 19th century military tactics going up against modern weapons like tanks and machine guns, not to mention the chemical warfare. Anyway, Balfour Declaration, they thought that the American media was controlled by the Jews, which was laughable. Most Jews in the early 20th century in the United States were recent arrivals from Russia and Eastern Europe. They were poor. Many couldn't even read English, and most of them did not vote. But this is what the British thought about the United States. Hey, we'll get the Jewish media in the United States on board with this declaration. That'll get the Americans in the war. Whether that's true or not, that there is some evidence that that was the thought process. The other thing to remember about the Balfour Declaration is that this was not done in a vacuum. The Brits were not in a position to unilaterally offer land they didn't own, okay? We're going to promise you land owned by the Ottomans, assuming we win the war, without consulting our allies, the French and the Italians, who are likewise losing lots and lots of men in this war. We're just going to The Brits didn't do that. They brought in this gentleman, Nahum Sokolov, who I mentioned, successor to Theodore Herzl, and because Sokolov, a gifted diplomat, born diplomat, multilingual, he basically shuttled back and forth between the government of France, the government of Britain, the government of Italy, even the Vatican, and he got the Brits, the French, the Vatican, the Italians, even the Japanese, even Woodrow Wilson, even though the U.S. didn't officially acknowledge this and approve it, Woodrow Wilson gave his approval. So the Brits' Balfour Declaration was issued with the approval of all of the allies in World War I. It was not the British on their own. It was not coerced by Lord Rothschild. It was delivered to Lord Rothschild, said, here, take this to your community. We're going to do all we can to create a national home. Again, not the national home, and maybe we'll change our minds later. But that was the story behind the Balfour Declaration. Again, the Vatican, which was kind of a shock given the previous statements by the prior popes, Pope Benedict XV, in May of 1917, told Sokolov, yes, I believe we will be good neighbors. Benedict, kind of reversing the previous, pious, you called the Jews dogs, and no, we can't recognize you because you. Benedict XV said, yes, this is a great idea. Jews deserve a national home in Palestine. Pius X, again, we can't recognize you because you denied Christ. More promises that went back and forth. My point with all of this, and I know this is kind of lengthy and a lot of names and a lot of dates, is to establish the fact that it wasn't one thing. Yes, Rothschild, Balfour Declaration, that's the Sykes-Picot, that's the reason the whole. No, there was a lot of stuff going on back in the teens and the 20s and the 30s and the 40s that led up to 1948. In 1918, January, a letter written by Sir Mark Sykes of Sykes-Picot on behalf of the British government, delivered by Commander David Hogarth to Sharif Hussein in Mecca, trying to clarify what did the Balfour Declaration mean. Basic points of the letter: 1, UK government supported Arab independence. 2, UK government also supported the return of Jews to Palestine. And point 3, in Palestine, no people should be subject to any other. Now, you'd think that would make everybody happy, but as we've seen in the last 100 years of Arab-Israeli relations, things like this make nobody happy. Okay, in 1967, when Moshe Dayan took the Temple Mount and said, let's make it available to Jews and Muslims, thinking that would make everybody happy. No, it's made nobody happy. But again, the Hogarth letter, 1918, diplomatic language, didn't really promise anything concrete to anybody, and left a lot of weasel room that left a lot of room for dispute. February of 1918, the Bassett letter, a letter from the British government to Sharif Hussein in Mecca, following Hussein's request for another explanation, this time of the Sykes-Picot Agreement. What are you British and French promising each other after the war is over? This dismissed the publication of the Sykes-Picot Agreement as an attempt by the Ottomans to create mistrust between the Arabs and the Brits. Again, it was supposed to be a secret treaty. The point being that it was no longer secret, it had been published, and so Sharif Hussein wanted to find out, wait, if you guys are carving up the territory, where do we fit in? June 16th, 1918, the declaration to the Seven being 7 Arab leaders in Damascus. This was written by Sir Mark Sykes, Sykes-Picot, response to a memorandum that had been issued anonymously by 7 Syrian political leaders in Cairo, actually, Cairo. They requested a guarantee of the ultimate independence of Arabia. The declaration to the Seven stated the British policy that future government of the regions of the Ottoman Empire occupied by the Allies of World War I, quote, should be based upon the principle of the consent of the governed, end quote. More diplomatic language that really doesn't promise anything concrete to anybody. The bottom line here, and this is a spoiler, the British didn't really mean it, and neither did the French. Oh yes, consent of the governed. You consent, don't you? Yeah, that's basically what that meant. November 7th, 1918, the Anglo-French declaration, this explained that the two powers had taken part in the battle for Ottoman territories, France and Great Britain explaining that their intentions were the complete and final liberation of the people and the establishment of democratic governments in Syria, Palestine, Iraq, and other territories still to be assisted in attaining their liberation. This was meant to convince the Arabs that, yes, we really are your friends. Yes, you really will be free. And that they had no colonialist or imperialist ambitions. But spoiler, they really did, the French and the Brits. Anyway, December 1st, 1918, Clemenceau, Lloyd George, the British and French prime ministers modified the Sykes-Picot Agreement, basically adjusting the boundaries of how they were carving up what was left of the Ottoman Empire in Mesopotamia and the Levant. 1919, we get to the League of Nations Charter, June 28th, 1919. Article 22 of the League of Nations went into effect on September 29th of 1923 and remained into effect until May 14th of 1948, which was the date that Israel declared its independence. This mandate required that Britain would put into effect the Balfour Declaration's national home for the Jewish people, alongside Palestinian Arabs. The problem was that in Palestine at the time you had 589,000 Muslims and about 84,000 Jews. By 1947, there were 1.2 million Muslims in the land and 630,000 Jews. Again, a bit of an imbalance there. But this was enshrined in the League of Nations Charter 1919, went into effect 1922. 1920, there was a conference I'd never heard of until researching this, the San Remo Conference, April 19th through 26th of 1920. This followed something called the Great Arab Revolt. This was the rebellion during World War I against the Ottoman Turks. The war, by the way, that inspired the movie Lawrence of Arabia. You've seen that? Yeah. T.E. Lawrence, archaeologist, but also military leader. He basically went native, helped the Arabs rebel against the Ottomans. The Brits really didn't think the Arabs were going to be of much use militarily. Lawrence actually turned them into a pretty effective fighting force. But as we will see, Lawrence actually was not as influential as another British guy you probably have not heard of. This San Remo conference confirmed the mandate allocated by the Balfour Declaration in 1917. 1922, in September, there was a joint resolution of the U.S. Congress that endorsed the British mandate for Palestine, so now the Americans are on board. This is called the Lodge-Fish Resolution. 1936, time moves on. The Peel Commission, or the Palestine Royal Commission, this was established by the British government because the Arabs had started getting a little angry. They were not happy that the Jews were flooding into the land and were actually making the land productive. They were beginning to get violent, and I'll talk about why here in just a little bit. But they established a new partition plan because they said that the League of Nations mandate was no longer workable. They wanted to partition what had been promised to Israel. And I've got some maps coming up so you can visualize what I'm talking about here. The Zionists were divided over the plan. They said, look, we should take it. We can work on, but we need to get a homeland first. Let's work on the borders later. The Arabs rejected the whole thing altogether. They said, nope, we're not going to agree to anything. There were factions within the groups, the Zionists and the Arabs. The Zionists, again, some of them being pragmatic said, look, let's take the deal. It's the best we're going to get for now, and then we can work on expanding the borders later. They can be adjusted later. Others said, no, these are too small. This is not what we were promised. We can't fit everybody into the land. Let's not take this. The Arabs, they just said they didn't want to deal with it at all. In fact, there was a guy named Amin al-Husseini, the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem. He was not happy about the partition plan because it would have required the Palestinian areas allotted to the Arabs to be merged with the Kingdom of Transjordan. And the Grand Mufti would have then become subordinate to the King of Jordan. So there was a lot of political stuff going on inside the Arab communities as well. There was a ruling in 1936 on the causes of the 1936 Arab Rebellion. The Arabs rose up and started attacking the Brits who were administering the mandate. This was partly the Arab desire for national independence, which still had not been recognized. I mean, World War I had ended in 1918. They were promised independent homelands, which they got in Iraq and Syria and Arabia, but they wanted Palestine as well. The commission found, and I think this is interesting, though the Arabs have benefited by the development of the country owing to Jewish immigration. I mean, the Jews are coming in and they're growing things. They're making the land productive. This has had no conciliatory effect. On the contrary, improvement in the economic situation in Palestine has meant the deterioration of the political situation. The Arabs were getting jealous. Quote, the Arab charge that the Jews have obtained too large a proportion of good land cannot be maintained, the commission found, because, quote, much of the land now carrying orange groves was sand dunes or swamps and uncultivated when it was purchased, end quote. The Jewish immigrants arriving from Russia, arriving from Europe, had come there, bought barren land, sand dunes, swamps, drained the swamps, started using sound agricultural process, a lot of the organics type stuff that you guys been teaching here this weekend. And suddenly the land was productive. You go to Israel now, you see every hillside has got, Doug, you've been there, you've seen this, every hillside has got like olive trees. It's terraced. It's catching the water that they get. The Arabs hadn't been doing that. They'd overgrazed the land with sheep and goats for 2,000 years. The topsoil had all blown away. When Mark Twain visited in the 1860s, he said, this is a desolate land. But by the 1930s, the Arabs are saying, the Jews have all the good land. It's because they moved there, bought it, and turned it productive. And the Brits, even though they were walking back their promises by this point, and I'll talk about that in a minute, they acknowledged that this is what was going on. 1938, the British established the Woodhead Commission, or the Palestine Partition Commission, February through August of 1938. They were established to propose a detailed partition for Palestine. In reality, it was created to bury the results of the previous commission, the Peel Commission, because it wasn't making anybody happy. So they're basically doing what government always does, which is try to cover up the earlier mistakes by pretending it didn't really happen. 1939, St. James Conference. This was February through March of 1939, called by the British government to plan the future of Palestine and the end of the Mandate. Britain planning to get out. This is really a problem. Nobody likes us there. The Jews don't like us. The Arabs don't like us. It's more trouble than it's worth. Let's figure out how we're going to get out of here. The problem was when they called the Zionists and the Arabs to meet to discuss how to resolve the situation, the Arab Higher Committee, the leaders of the Arab community in Palestine, refused to sit in the same room with the Jews. A little hard to negotiate, to discuss, to settle differences when you won't even talk to the other party. The process ended after about 5.5 weeks, and this led to the White Paper of 1939, which was essentially a response to the Arab Revolution of 1936 through 1939. The Arabs, again rebelling and getting violent with the Brits, called for the establishment of a Jewish national home in an independent Palestinian state within the next 10 years. It was approved in the House of Commons on May 23rd of 1939. So the Brits said, okay, good, independent state, let's go. But at the same time that they voted for this, they said, oh, but no more Jews can immigrate to Palestine. So we'll create an independent state, but to try to keep the Arabs happy, no more Jews can go. This, again, 1939, the Nazis were in power in Germany, and they were beginning to do things that made it look like the Jews were not really safe there. And rather than saying, let's open up immigration, at least they'll be safe there, nope, they shut down immigration to Palestine completely. And then, of course, World War II. So let me show you with these maps now how all of these various promises and conferences and commissions and findings and white papers resulted in the changing promises made to the Zionists. Originally, 1920, the mandate that was promised to Israel by the League of Nations, Article 22 of the League of Nations Charter promised them everything that is now Israel plus everything that is Jordan. Bearing in mind that the Arabs, who were upset about this, had already received, by this point, independent homelands in Syria, in Arabia, and in Iraq. But they wanted this as well. So by the time the mandate went into effect in 1922, League of Nations said, okay, well, we'll cut it off at the Jordan River. So the Jews can have what's west of the Jordan River. All of this will become a new Arab state called Transjordan. So this, within 2 years, they'd gone from the whole of this to having it cut to less than a quarter of that, 23%. Then 1939, the Woodhead Commission, as they were trying to figure out how to make the Arabs happy, how to keep their promises to the Jews, the Woodhead Commission came up with 3 different partition plans. Plan A, with the Jewish state in orange, that's a little bit smaller than what we'd seen in the previous map. The Arab state in purple, and this orange area here to be an international territory administered by the League of Nations or some other international body. The Vatican's like, yeah, we'll do it. Plan B, smaller yet, Plan C, with the Jewish territory limited to that little area along the coast. Those were the 3 plans proposed by the British government as they were trying to figure out how to get out of Palestine without another war starting. By the time of 1947, this is what the United Nations finally settled on, November 29th of 1947. The areas in white belonging to the Jews, the areas in gold belonging to the Arabs. Now, military veterans here in the office, here in the audience? Okay. Looking at this with a military eye, how would you describe this? Indefensible? Yeah. At its narrowest point up here west of Jerusalem, that's only 9 miles across. Indefensible. But this is what the United Nations offered to the Zionists in 1947. This was adopted as Resolution 181. The Arab state was to have a territory about 11,100 square miles. Jewish state, about 14,100 square miles. The remaining 2% around Jerusalem and Bethlehem, because of the religious significance of those 2 cities, to be administered by an international body of some sort. Critics called this plan pro-Zionist. Yeah. 56% of the land allocated to the Jews, even though this is far less than what was promised to them originally back in 1920 or 22. It was accepted by the Jewish Agency for Palestine. They weren't happy about it, but you're like, okay, it's better than nothing. We'll take that. We can work on the borders later. The Arab Higher Committee, the rulers, the leaders of the Arab community in Palestine, they rejected it. Said, out of hand. Nope, we're not going to abide by this. And they announced they would take all necessary measures to prevent the implementation of the United Nations resolution. So the result was the 1947 and 48 civil war in Palestine, which is the first phase of what became known as the 1948 Arab-Israeli War, which began basically the minute David Ben-Gurion declared independence. So here's what we're looking at again, the change from 1922 to 1947. What was promised by world consensus, the League of Nations. So again, reminder, Balfour Declaration, which was conducted with the approval of all of the allies, the winning side in World War I, the San Remo Conference, world consensus, and the League of Nations in 1922. And this is what the world finally said, okay, well, you can have this. Again, not stolen land, world consensus saying, yes, we consent to the creation of an independent Jewish state on this land. Even though the promises changed, remember 1920, all of Jordan was included in this. Frankly, having been to Jordan, wonderful people there. But I'm not sure it would be interesting to see what the Jews would have done with it. Because Jordan is a very water-poor land. We in America, we take water for granted. Go to a restaurant, you get free water. Jordan, do not drink the water out of the tap, and you pay for bottled water at the restaurant. I suspect that had Jews been in control of Jordan for the last 100 years, they would have been desalinating the Red Sea like crazy. And Jordan would be just as green as a large part of Israel. So the question is then, how did we get from this to this? Here's where we get to the secret history, the stuff that is not in the history books. This is the part that many of the players involved would just as soon you never heard about. A lot of this, and I will recommend this book to you if you want to do a deeper dive in it, because I can only scratch the surface. A book published in 1994, so it's not even a new book anymore. It only goes up through the George H.W. Bush administration and the beginning of that, called The Secret War Against the Jews, by a former Department of Justice prosecutor named John Loftus, L-O-F-T-U-S, and an investigative journalist from Australia named Mark Aarons, A-A-R-O-N-S. The two of them, dug deep into files obtained through Freedom of Information Act requests in the United States, interviews with intelligence operatives from the US, the UK, France, and Israel. And they put together a history that is shocking, and it shows that contrary to what critics of Israel would like to believe, the powerful forces at work in the 20th century were opposed to the creation of Israel and tried very hard to stop it. Let me introduce you to Philby of Arabia. Doesn't quite have the ring of Lawrence of Arabia, but St. John Philby, Harry St. John Bridger Philby completely, Jack Philby to his friends, was dismissed from the Secret Service by Britain. He was working in India, dismissed from the Secret Service because of sexual misconduct. Now, apparently, for spies, that's not considered a bug, it's a feature. If you're willing to do things, you can corrupt and co-opt people from whom you want to get information. Philby apparently was one of those guys. So he was recruited by MI6, Britain's version of the CIA, in 1915. He was reportedly bisexual, which in British society, considering the well-connected network of homosexuals in British aristocracy. It actually helped his career. That's just the way it was. He was trained by Gertrude Bell, who was a known archaeologist, but also MI6 agent working in Arabia, and he worked with T.E. Lawrence of Arabia, although they wound up on opposite sides of the Arabs fighting for control of Arabia after the Ottomans collapsed. Lawrence supported Sharif Hussein, who I mentioned earlier. He was the one demanding, hey, explain this. What is this this agreement that you and the French have got? Sharif Hussein was a direct linear descendant of Muhammad. And so to Sunni Arabs, he was the rightful heir and leader of the Arab community. 3 of his sons wound up as kings, the king of Jordan, the king of Iraq, and later the king of Arabia, briefly. And I'll talk about the Arabian thing in just a minute. Lawrence was a supporter of Sharif Hussein. His sons, Ali, who wound up king of Iraq, Abdullah, who became king of, Ali was the king of Saudi Arabia, rather. Not Saudi Arabia, it became Saudi Arabia later. Ali became king of Arabia briefly. Abdullah became king of Iraq. Faisal became king of, Abdullah became king of Jordan. Faisal became king of Iraq. You think I keep these names straight in my head? Barely. Lawrence, anyway, was behind them, and because Lawrence was instrumental in helping them overthrow the Ottomans and the Ottoman control of Mesopotamia, he was pushing for Ali, the son of Sharif Hussein, to become the next leader of the Arabs. Philby had been sent in 1917 with a message to a rival of Sharif Hussein, a guy named Ibn Saud, from whom we get the name Saudi Arabia. Saudi is not the ethnicity, it's the family name. It would be like calling the United States Trumpy America, okay? Ibn Saud wanted to be the leader of the Arabs, and so he was conducting raids on Hussein. Philby was sent to Ibn Saud to say, knock it off. The British government does not approve. But instead, because Philby was still upset at being fired by the British government, he had an axe to grind. And so he started giving intelligence to Ibn Saud. Here's where Hussein's got his troops. Here's how he's got Mecca defended. And he actually helped Ibn Saud defeat Hussein and Hussein's son Ali in battle, which is why Saudi Arabia is Saudi Arabia. It was essentially created by a British intelligence agent who went rogue, Jack Philby. Philby, because of what he was seeing from the British government, like the Balfour Declaration, he realized that the Arabs were being played, which in fact they were. Yes, we'll promise you an independent homeland, but we're also promising an independent homeland to the Jews. Well, Philby was an anti-Semite, as many in Britain were at that time. He realized that Palestine was being used as a way to motivate the Arabs to do what the British government wanted them to do, but he recognized that the Brits were going to throw the Arabs under the bus after World War I, which they kind of did. So even though the British government was kind of playing the Zionists as well, yes, we'll promise you an independent, we'll promise you a Jewish state, a Jewish homeland, not a Jewish state. They really were trying to restrict immigration, and again, after 1939, they cut it off altogether. But Philby thought that even a few Jews allowed into Palestine was too many. Philby really hated Jews. And so when he went to Ibn Saud in 1917, he began sharing this intelligence and convincing Ibn Saud that the British government was playing him for a fool. Now, after the Ottoman army was defeated in Palestine, the Arabs were of no further use to Britain. We've won the war, we've got the land, thank you for your service, now go back to your desert. Philby felt betrayed, so he began feeding intelligence to Ibn Saud that helped Ibn Saud defeat Sharif Hussein, took control of Mecca in 1922, and it became Saudi Arabia. As a result, Ibn Saud took Philby into his inner circle. And Philby actually went native. He converted to Islam. At the age of 40, he converted to Islam. Now, you do understand that becoming Muslim, like becoming a Jew, requires being circumcised at the age of 40. It's one thing when it's done when you're a newborn baby and you don't remember it, but at the age of 40, this requires a level of personal commitment that I do not share. Philby went totally native. And now, even though he had picked a different side in this Arab conflict, because remember, T.E. Lawrence of Arabia was backing Sharif Hussein, Philby backed his opponent, who actually wound up winning and becoming the leader of Arabia, creating the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. Because of his disobedience, Philby got fired by MI6, but Lawrence saved his career, said, okay, look, I need him in Amman, Jordan, to help MI6 in the Transjordan. So Philby was transferred to Amman. He became the top MI6 operative in Jordan and what later became Israel. And he began working behind the scenes against the official policy of Britain's Foreign Office in London. He began stirring up Arab Christians and Muslims against the Jewish settlers. In other words, he trained Arabs in terrorist tactics to try to scare away the Jewish settlers in Palestine. Arab terrorism in Palestine was the product of a rogue British intelligence officer, Jack Philby. The waves of terror that made the Foreign Office in the 1930s say, oh, the Arabs are really unhappy. We need to change plans here. Let's redivide the land and create these new partitions here, and let's give more land to the Arabs. It was because a rogue MI6 agent, Jack Philby, was stirring up the Arabs against the Jews. And again, I say Arabs, not Muslims, because it was Arab Christians as well. There's a lot of ethnic hatred there. And the British government began walking back their promises. Well, you know, the Balfour Declaration only promised a national home, not the national home. So, you know, just settle down and maybe think about that Uganda thing again. And the land promised to the Zionists back in 1920, which shrank by 77%, and then again in the 1930s, began to shrink because of the influence of Jack Philby and the terrorists that he was training and arming with British weapons. Now, and in fact, in 1923, Philby helped the Kingdom of Transjordan, which is now the country of Jordan, set up the Arab Legion, their military. He set it up, helped train it, and got British weapons for the Jordanian army. In 1924, Philby left the Transjordan, and this was as Ibn Saud was setting up his kingdom in Mecca, making his final assault, conquering the son of Sharif Hussein, Ali, and joined Ibn Saud in Mecca as one of his top advisors. The Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, bottom line, was created by a renegade, anti-Semitic British spy, Jack Philby. In between 1925 and 1930, he basically served as a double agent, reporting back to Britain what he thought they needed to know, but then sharing information with the Arabs that he wanted them to know. Then converted to Islam. Ibn Saud told Philby that if he became a Muslim, he could have 4 wives, and apparently that was enough for Philby to go through the procedure and become a Muslim. This is what Philby looked like in his Arab garb. This is a bit of history that most of us have never heard before. Until I read this book, I had heard of his son, Kim Philby, who was a noted double agent for the Russians, for the KGB. Kim was pretty warped because his father was a warped guy. Jack Philby basically abandoned his son Kim and his wife back in Britain while he was off having adventures in Arabia. In 1929, Philby visited Jerusalem and became friends with the fellow I mentioned earlier, Hajj Amin al-Husseini, the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem. Al-Husseini was very much an Arab nationalist. He did not want the Jews getting a homeland in Palestine, partly because his family had been ruling in Jerusalem for centuries. He didn't want to be a subject of the King of Jordan either. He fancied himself to be sort of a regional king. During the Arab Rebellion of 1937, the Brits were hunting for him, trying to track him down because he was leading Arab raids against the British. He fled Palestine in 1937 to avoid being arrested and wound up in Italy and then in Germany, where he became friends with a fellow named Adolf Hitler. Al-Husseini was, let's say, shared common cause with Hitler as regards their attitude towards the Jews. To show you how much Hitler valued Al-Husseini was paid 50,000 German marks per month during World War II, at a time when the top German field marshals like Erwin Rommel were making 25,000 marks per year. This guy was making twice as much a month as the top German commanders in the field were making in a year. And he was broadcasting propaganda on the radio back to Palestine, trying to get the Arabs to rise up and throw off the Brits, because by this point, by 1939 anyway, they were at war with Britain, and it was the same old story. Let's use the Arabs to fight against who's ever controlling the land where the Arabs live. But think about this. This British intelligence officer became friends with a guy who later literally became friends with Hitler, was made an officer in the SS. Al-Husseini helped Himmler recruit 3 divisions of Waffen SS troops, Muslim SS soldiers in the Baltics, not the Baltics, in Bosnia. So, the other aspect of this that comes into play is oil. There were oil discoveries made in Bahrain and Kuwait around 1930, and American oil companies were very, very interested in the wealth that could be made there. You know, you got Standard Oil, Texaco, Citgo. Standard Oil and Texaco were the big players at that time back in the 1930s, and they were very interested in pushing the British oil companies, especially British Petroleum, out of the Middle East. Well, Jack Philby talked Ibn Saud into exploring for oil in his kingdom, and that was the seed of what became Aramco, the Arabian American oil company. The last time I checked, about 2 weeks ago, Saudi Aramco is worth about $1.8 trillion. And it began because Jack Philby, MI6 agent, convinced the guy who he helped become king of Arabia dig for oil. Now, American companies, because of his behind-the-scenes double dealing, were cut in on the deal. The British, who thought they had a deal with Ibn Saud, were cut out. The 1930s, 1940s, a lot of competition between American and British industry. Americans trying to squeeze out British interests in Arabia, but also South America. As an advisor to Ibn Saud, Philby negotiated the deal with Standard Oil of California over the next few years, Texaco Mobil, and Standard Oil of New Jersey. The Rockefellers also got in on oil deals with the Arabs in Saudi Arabia. And it turned out that a number of executives in Texaco, Standard Oil of New Jersey, were also strong supporters of fascism. Hitler's making the trains run on time, and we agree with him about the Jews. After the Spanish Civil War was won by the fascists led by Generalissimo Francisco Franco, American oil companies sold oil to Hitler by selling it to Franco. Weren't supposed to sell to Germany directly, but you could sell to Franco, and then Franco turned around and sold it to Hitler. So Philby, double agent, working for the Brits, working for the Arabs. He also made a trip to Germany. Apparently, with permission by Ibn Saud, he went to work as a double agent for the Third Reich. Philby was playing all sides against everybody. Basically, he was in business for Philby. He publicly said he was helping the Jews, trying to help them get out of the country, but privately he was helping the Nazis and always turning a profit for himself. In 1937, Philby began negotiating with the Zionist leader David Ben-Gurion about a plan to allow Jewish immigration into Palestine, unlimited Jewish immigration, under the protection of Ibn Saud. But his true motive was to sabotage that 1939 Congress, that the convention, the conference that the British had set up to try to figure out how to divide up the land and get out of Palestine. Philby was trying to torpedo it. The plan was leaked to the press. The Zionists were blamed for the leak. In fact, the whole thing, which fell apart, was because of Philby working behind the scenes to torpedo any kind of an agreement to help the Jews get out of Germany, get out of Europe, and get to a safe place. The British Foreign Office, U.S. State Department were both afraid that the Third Reich would be willing and eager to shut down the gas chambers and empty the concentration camps and send them to Britain, Canada, the United States. This was part of a meeting of British and U.S. officials in 1943, the Bermuda Conference, 1943. Both nations knew that the Holocaust was in full swing, but the U.S. and the U.K. decided that nothing should be done about it. Because, hey, if Hitler shuts down the gas chambers, all those Jews will come here. We don't want them. Well, you could send them to Palestine. No, that'll make the Arabs mad. And our oil company buddies will lose their contracts. Basically, it came down to this. The Arabs had oil, the Jews did not. And between British Petroleum for the UK, Texaco, Standard Oil of New Jersey, Standard Oil of California in the US, with all of the influence that those companies had with the governments of the UK and the US, the Bermuda Conference was sunk. The Arabs had oil, and the Jews did not. Now, we move to the United States and a couple of men whose names you've probably heard of. You've ever flown into Washington, D.C., Dulles Airport? Yeah. Alan and John Foster Dulles, two brothers who wielded a lot of influence in the United States from the 1920s through the early 1960s, really. Alan Dulles, he's the fellow on the left here. He was the spy. He met Jack Philby in 1921 when he was stationed in Istanbul. Philby recruited Dulles as his American partner to influence U.S. foreign policy against allowing a Jewish homeland, and later to help get American oil companies partnered up with the Arabs to develop Arab oil wealth. With Dulles' help, Philby ensured the survival of Ibn Saud's kingdom because he became insanely wealthy. The American oil partnerships, the oil companies, helped develop that wealth and helped push the British out of Arabia, which again, Philby still harboring a grudge for being fired back in 1915 from the Social Service. Dulles headed up the State Department's Middle East section from 1922 to 1926. He argued that the utility of a Jewish state was zero. There's no point to it. What good would a Jewish state be? And besides, it would complicate American oil companies getting concessions from the Arabs. It would make the Arabs mad. The Arabs have oil and the Jews do not. His brother, John Foster Dulles, fellow on the right, both of these guys were lawyers at a very prominent law firm that exists in Washington, D.C. to this day, Sullivan and Cromwell. If you had a problem in D.C. and you really needed the top law firm there, you go to Sullivan and Cromwell. Dulles created an interlocking financial network of American oil men, Nazi corporations, and Saudi Arabia. Basically created the legal framework to hide the interconnections between companies like IG Farben and Standard Oil of New Jersey and their partnerships with the Arabs. It was through the work of John Foster and Alan Dulles and their legal machinations behind the scenes that these investments were kept quiet. Dulles led a team of US and British investors that funded the Nazi Party early on. It was really through the investment that came from the US and the UK that the Nazis in the early 1930s survived as a political party. Hey, these guys would be great for business. I don't think, and the authors of the book, The Secret War Against the Jews, did not think that these guys were actually thinking about, hey, this will ultimately lead to concentration camps and gas chambers. They were just looking at guys who wanted to make lots of money. And the Germans were putting together an industrial powerhouse at a time when it was difficult to make money in the 1930s because we were in the Great Depression, and frankly, Roosevelt was kind of a socialist. So it was tough to make money in the US. But the Germans, hey, it was blowing and going. And then the Arabs were finding oil all over the place. And the Germans needed oil. So through Philby, his connection with Allen and John Foster Dulles, a long convoluted story, but the short form is this, that by 1940, just before America got into World War II, Jack Philby represented the Saudi sellers of oil, Allen Dulles represented the German buyers like I.G. Farben, and John Foster Dulles represented the German bankers and the Spanish investors. Arab oil sold through American investors to the Spanish, who then turned around and sold it to Hitler. Dulles' client, Standard Oil, when their role in facilitating this transfer of oil to Hitler's Germany during World War II was threatened, so there was a Senate committee chaired by Harry S. Truman that was investigating this. Standard Oil of New Jersey, the Rockefellers, threatened to withhold oil from the American government at a time when we needed it for the war, obtained bribes from the US government totaling $100 million between 1943 and 1947 to pay off King Ibn Saud, to keep him happy, and then jacked up the prices to the US government, while still selling oil to Hitler through Generalissimo Francisco Franco. Think about that. An oil company basically blackmailed the United States government. Hey, it would be really too bad if we had to shut down all this oil coming from Arabia to put in our planes and our tanks and our ships. But if you make this investigation go away, we can see our way clear. But we need $100 million for Ibn Saud. And you're going to pay 50% more. Astonishing. Yeah, guess what? The deep state did not just come out of nowhere when Donald Trump was elected president in 2016. That bribe, by the way, paid to Ibn Saud was what got British Petroleum kicked out of Arabia. Jack Philby had a long memory, and he really hated his own government. Standard Oil of New Jersey, again, they derailed that Senate investigation. Again, remember, John D. Rockefeller, his son Nelson Rockefeller, later governor of New Jersey, later vice president of the United States, blackmailing the United States government. I cannot emphasize this enough. According to Ahrens and Loftus in their book, Allen Dulles, his client, Standard Oil of New Jersey, blackmailing the United States in the middle of World War II. The intelligence officers, the veteran guys who'd worked for the OSS, for the State Department's intelligence services, for the CIA, they flat out said, Allen Dulles is a traitor who should have been hanged. They minced no words. They were actively working not just against the United States government policy regarding the Jews, but sabotaging the war effort because it threatened their profits. As long as Dulles' clients controlled access to Arab oil, they could get away with just about anything, including blackmailing the government of the United States. Allen Dulles, who, with another intelligence operative named James Jesus Angleton, set up the rat lines, using the Vatican as well, to get German officers and German money out of Germany before and after World War II, and also cover up the names on the accounts of the American investors who'd put their money into Hitler's Germany. Dulles brothers almost got caught. Franklin Delano Roosevelt had a pretty good idea of what Allen Dulles was up to, and so he put a bug in Dulles' office, put him under surveillance. And the game was almost up. He almost got caught, but apparently Roosevelt's vice president, Henry Wallace, who's the guy responsible, by the way, for the pyramid with the all-seeing eye on top on the back of our dollar bill. Wallace was a 32nd degree Freemason, like Roosevelt. Wallace apparently had a big mouth, and he told his brother-in-law, who was a consul, a diplomat for the Swiss, over dinner one night, "Yeah, we've got the goods on Dulles." Next thing you know, the Germans are telling Dulles, "You've been compromised." This is why it appears Wallace was not the vice president when Roosevelt ran for president in 1948, why Harry S. Truman was replaced Wallace on the ticket. Wallace blabbed, Dulles covered his tracks, and FDR was not able to nail him. Again, this according to veteran intelligence operatives in the United States. The Dulles brothers facilitated Hitler's Germany and then covered up the activity of bankers like Brown Brothers Harriman, which included George H.W. Walker Bush's father, Prescott Bush, and the activities of other prominent Chase Bank, and of course the Rockefellers and Standard Oil of New Jersey and so forth. Now, how did Israel manage to overcome all of this opposition? We had the bankers, you had the industrialists, you had the intelligence agents who were influenced by the bankers and the oil men, opposed the creation of an independent Jewish state. A guy named Richard Kauder, he was an Austrian who worked in German intelligence during World War II. Jewish man working for German intelligence in World War II. He set up a network that he called the MAX network, M-A-X, Jewish intelligence officers who were working for the Soviets, for the Germans, for the Brits, for the French, for the Americans. As World War II progressed, and they saw that nobody was coming to save them, especially after the Bermuda Conference in 1943. They realized that if we were going to protect ourselves, if we Jews are going to protect ourselves, we're going to have to do it on our own because no one is coming to save us. And so Kauder, through his connections with other Jewish intelligence officers, basically he had the only intelligence organization that penetrated every nation that had a role in World War II. The Soviets, the Germans, the French, the Brits, the Americans. And he began to share information back and forth to benefit the goal of an independent Jewish state. In fact, Kauder and the Max network arguably did more to bring down Hitler's Germany than the OSS, than the precursor to the KGB, than all Western intelligence operations combined. For example, Soviet intelligence used a network of so-called fascist Jews to penetrate the inner circle of Hitler's government. And because of this, they were able to spread disinformation inside the German military that helped make the German offensive in Russia vulnerable. They basically fed misinformation to deceive the Germans as to where the Russian military assets were located, and then the superior numbers of the Russians basically overwhelmed the Germans. The Germans had superior weaponry, superior training, but the Russians just had the numbers. And when the Germans were basically blinded by the disinformation coming from the Max network, they were caught blindsided. Now, the Jews of the Max network, mostly communist double agents, German intelligence thought they were getting great information from inside the Kremlin, when in fact they were being deceived. But inadvertently, the Max network uncovered Allen Dulles' dirty little secret. The fact that Allen Dulles was trying to get German money and German, officers out of Germany before they were caught and then put on trial or whatever. Especially the money smuggling aspect of this, trying to get the money of his investors, like Brown Brothers Harriman and Chase and the other bankers in the United States, the oilmen. They were trying to get it out of Germany before it was captured. and before the paperwork could be traced back to his customers. He was trying to hide the identities of his American investors. Cowder and the Max Network went to Dulles and said, look, we'll keep your secret, but you're going to have to get some Jews out of the concentration camps. If you wanted to move Nazi money across Switzerland via the Vatican, we'll let you do it for a price, but that price is Jewish lives. We'll keep the secret of the rat lines if you will let the Jews. And so this led to a really bizarre situation. 1944, Allen Dulles had to communicate to the head of SS intelligence, Walter Schellenberg. If the SS wanted to get its money out of German banks before they were captured by the Americans or the Russians, they were going to have to empty the concentration camps and let some of the Jews go. Schellenberg had to go to Heinrich Himmler. He said, look, we have a problem. Himmler said, okay, fine. So the last remnants of the Jews still in the concentration camps who had not yet been sent to the gas chambers were let go. They were put on trains or they were marched westward here, go ahead to the American lines. Many of them died on the way, but a few of them were saved because this Austrian Jew working for German intelligence blackmailed Allen Dulles, who later became the head of the CIA. We'll keep your secret. You can get your Nazi money out of Germany if you save a few Jewish lives. To hide the money that was being taken out, the SS had to print up fake money and stick it in the bank vaults. Jewish agents in Swiss banks were watching over the operation to make sure that things were going as planned. By 1944, the Zionists had realized, look, there is nobody coming for us. The Americans aren't coming to save us. The British aren't coming to save us. We've got to do this ourselves. And so many of these agents in Cowder's Max Network defected to the cause of David Ben-Gurion, the first Prime Minister of Israel. After the war, it became obvious that the Nazis would not face justice. The Soviets executed several thousand Nazi war criminals, but the Americans and the Brits executed a few dozen, and the rest were let go. So the founder of the Max Network, Richard Cowder, turned himself into the U.S. Army in Austria in 1945. He had a lot of valuable information because he knew where his agents were placed. Inside the Kremlin, inside Germany. But when he was interrogated, the Americans were shocked to find a Jew had been working for Hitler's Germany, and they beat him bloody. So Cowder refused to cooperate. Said, forget it. So Cowder said, the only one I can trust is Ben-Gurion. He wouldn't trust the Americans, didn't trust the Brits, certainly didn't trust the Russians. So because the American interrogators wanted to teach him a lesson, the information they could have gained was instead turned over to David Ben-Gurion. Ben-Gurion basically blackmailed the United States and the Soviet Union into getting the votes needed for the United Nations to approve Resolution 181, creating the independent Jewish state. How did this happen? Well, the Soviets. Cowder had revealed to Ben-Gurion that the Max Network had not only penetrated German intelligence, but it was embedded in British and American intelligence as well. Now, Ben-Gurion let Stalin know that he knew where the Russian agents were in the United States. We know that you've got agents inside this new thing called the Central Intelligence Agency. And if you want to continue getting information from the CIA for the KGB, you will get the Soviet bloc to vote in favor of an independent Jewish state. Now, as Americans, like, now wait a minute, this is kind of, but given the way the American government and elements within it had treated the Jews to this point, I'm not sure I would have done differently in Ben-Gurion's position. Ben-Gurion said he wanted a country. That was the price for keeping quiet. You get the Soviet bloc to vote in the UN for us, and we will keep quiet about your agents inside the Central Intelligence Agency. And suddenly, on a dime in 1947, the Soviet Union became leading advocate for the creation of an independent Jewish state. This was not an easy thing for Joseph Stalin. He did not like the Jews. In fact, there was a joke told by Russian Jews that 1,000 years from now, Adolf Hitler will be remembered as a petty tyrant who lived at the time of Stalin. That's how much Stalin hated the Jews. He had purged his government in the 1930s to drive leading Jewish communists out of power in the military and in the Communist Party. During the 1945 Yalta Conference with Churchill and Roosevelt, Stalin opposed any Jewish objectives in Palestine that were not approved by the Arabs. And of course, the Arabs were not open to any Jewish immigration into Palestine. But again, in 1947, suddenly Stalin's like, yep, independent Jewish state in Palestine, because he wanted to keep his moles inside the Central Intelligence Agency. Bear in mind that during the 50s, Alan Dulles, who by the way thought that he had all of these great agents that had been left over from the Max network, that were in fact reporting back to Stalin, 98% of American assets behind the Iron Curtain in the 1950s terminated because the CIA was so badly compromised by Russian agents. Many of them Jews who were also feeding information to Ben-Gurion. Ben-Gurion then went to the Americans. Truman had taken over after Roosevelt's death, had to deal with the deep state as well. Our first Secretary of Defense, the department created after we decided to rebrand the Secretary of War, that sounds a little too, warlike, Secretary of Defense James Forrestal. Forrestal, very much anti-Semitic. He led a cabal of senior State Department officials and intelligence officials, including guys who were no longer officially in the government, like Alan Dulles, John Foster Dulles, working behind Truman's back to block the creation of an independent Israel. It's not well known, but the United States blockaded weapons shipments to the Zionists in Palestine in the late 1940s. Even after 1948, when Israel declared independence, the United States would not send weapons to Israel. Truman was in favor of an independent Jewish state, but he had guys in his cabinet, like Forrestal, and guys working behind the scenes, very prominent bankers, lawyers, like the Dulles brothers, like Rockefeller, working on behalf of Arab interests. Forrestal was also a good friend of Alan Dulles, basically Dulles' spy inside the White House. Forrestal had been a spy or been a banker before the war. His bank, Dillon Reed and Company, was one of those banks that had bankrolled Hitler back in the 1930s. So he had no motive to expose his role and benefit the Israelis. He wanted to keep everything quiet. Forrestal was convinced that controlling Middle Eastern oil was America's national interest. So therefore, the Jews were expendable. Because again, the Arabs have oil and the Jews do not. So, debate in the United Nations on the issue of a Jewish state, scheduled to begin on November 26th of 1947. U.S. intelligence declared that Palestine was a hotbed of unrest where the Soviets would seize any opportunity to secure advantage. U.S. intelligence basically saying, we can't create a Jewish state because the Soviets will use the unrest that would follow to weaken American influence in the Middle East. Read that as weaken our hold on Middle Eastern oil. The CIA repeatedly warned that the Arabs would be very hostile to any creation of a Jewish state there. Again, Standard Oil of New Jersey, Standard Oil of California, Texaco, lots of money invested there. Major industrial companies like Bechtel that had billions of dollars in contracts with the Saudis. They were totally opposed to this. If you think the President of the United States can just basically sign a document and overrule all of these guys, that's really naivety. And I admit, I was naive until I really started digging into this. The deep state did not emerge with Donald Trump. It has been there all along. The CIA said basically a vote for Israel meant shutting off the oil supply of the United States. That's what Truman was facing in 1948, 1947. So the UN vote, they had a preliminary ballot November 25th. The vote carried in the ad hoc committee 25-13, but they needed a 2/3 majority to pass in the UN General Assembly. Now, several Western nations that had previously supported the idea of a Jewish state abstained, and if they did so at the final vote on November 29th, the vote would fail. So the Zionists had 3 days, interestingly. They had 3 days to secure at least 4 more votes and reverse the abstentions to get the vote to pass, creating an independent Jewish state. Now, Truman had the delegation, his delegation at the UN, get basically an adjournment so that they could lobby the governments in Central and South America that had voted against Israel. Now, why were the governments in Central and South America voting against Israel? You ever seen the movie Boys from Brazil? Okay, a lot of Germans who had left Germany on the rat lines wound up in Argentina and Brazil and Peru and so on. A lot of pro-fascist, anti-Jewish sentiment in Central and South America. A lot of Soviet influence in Central and South America as well. Now, the American delegation in the UN was also opposed to Truman. They wanted to support the Arabs because, well, it's good for business. It's good for the oil business. Truman ordered them to stand down, and he made it very clear that heads would roll if they did not do exactly what he told them. Now, here's where we come to an interesting fellow by the name of Nelson Rockefeller, who I mentioned previously. In 1940, James Forrestal had offered Rockefeller his first government job. This was the post of Coordinator of Inter-American Affairs. Basically, he was responsible for coordinating American relations with Central America and South America. In reality, it was an intelligence operation. It was like pre-CIA intelligence in Central and South America. Nelson, son of John D. Rockefeller Jr., they owned Standard Oil of New Jersey. Second largest block of stock in Standard of New Jersey was owned by IG Farben, the German chemical company that created the gas that was used in the gas chambers. Yeah. Standard Oil of New Jersey also developed the process of creating synthetic oil out of coal. Germany had a lot of coal, but no oil. But if they could convert coal to oil, which they did with the Standard Oil of New Jersey patent, they could alleviate their problem. And of course, Standard was also selling them oil from Arabia through Spain during the war. Well, Nelson Rockefeller delivered the votes that were needed because he was paid a visit. Now, again, there were 3 days for them to get the votes needed. Rockefeller, even though he had been fired by Truman by this point, still had a lot of influence with prominent government officials and business leaders in Central and South America. Again, Rockefeller, was he a fascist? I don't know, but he liked making money. And again, the money was to be made with Germany and the Arabs during World War II. Of course, after 1945, that became very embarrassing. People didn't want that information out there. Rockefeller was paid a visit by an agent from David Ben-Gurion. And according to the intelligence officials quoted in the book by Ahrens and Loftus, this is how the visit went, or sometime on or about November 26th of 1947. This was really good timing for this visit because 2 months before this visit, a federal judge had ruled in a civil case, quote, Standard Oil can be considered an enemy national in view of its relationships with IG Farben after the United States and Germany had become active enemies, unquote. So again, there was a court case where they had been declared an enemy national. That is treason, which is punishable by death. Now, it's not likely that a billionaire or millionaire at the time, like Rockefeller, was going to suffer that penalty, but still pretty embarrassing. And Rockefeller may have wanted to limit the damage to a few corporate scapegoats. Middle management, they were responsible. I didn't know anything about it. We'll throw them under the bus. But then Ben-Gurion's agent walks in and lays a dossier out on the table. They didn't have time to negotiate. Said, look, we don't have time to go to the press and threaten to expose you and all that. Here's what we know. And we will take this to the press and publish this if you do not make some phone calls and get the nations in Central and South America to change their vote on the question of Israel. So, besides the business activities during the war, Rockefeller, when he was running this Office of Inter-American Affairs, had been tasked with keeping Nazis out of South America. In fact, he facilitated Nazis coming into South America. Standard Oil leased its Venezuelan office from a Nazi-owned company. He turned a blind eye to Standard Oil shipments of oil to Spain that went on to Germany. And so the Jewish agent that presented this dossier showed Rockefeller, look, we've got the bank records with Nazis' signatures on these records. We've got transcripts of conversations you had with Nazi officers during World War II. Evidence of complicity in helping Allen Dulles smuggle Nazi money out of Germany on the rat lines. All of this on the desk in front of him. The account of what happened next was given to the authors and researchers of the book, The Secret War Against the Jews. And the source that they quote was described as a very aged Israeli former intelligence officer who served under David Ben-Gurion's chief of intelligence. He said Rockefeller looked through the dossier, and instead of panicking, he began to negotiate. Rockefeller said, okay, look, in exchange for the votes of the Latin American countries, I want guarantees that you Jews keep your mouths shut about the Nazi money that went from Germany to South America. There'll be no Nazi hunting, no testimony at the Nuremberg trials about the bankers or anyone else, not a single leak to the press about where the Nazis are living in South America or any of the Nazis that were working for Allen Dulles. The subject of the Nazis was to be closed forever. Boom. Basically, what Rockefeller told this Jewish intelligence agent was this: you can have a country or you can have vengeance. You cannot have both. Now, that agent did not expect Rockefeller to negotiate. They did not expect to be counter-blackmailed. So he had to put in a phone call to David Ben-Gurion. Bear in mind, this is not back in the day where you could just, speed dial on your cell phone and a guy would pick up on the other side of the ocean. You had to go through landlines, connect. He had to wait 7 hours for a return phone call. Understand what Rockefeller was telling them. You can have a country, but the cost is going to be the blood of 6 million Jews. And after 7 hours, the call came back. Yes. Now, the promise by the Zionists to keep quiet about all of this was conditional upon Rockefeller delivering the votes at the United Nations. If we don't get the votes, this goes public. Rockefeller said, you'll get your votes. 3 days later, when the vote was called in the United Nations, Brazil and Haiti changed from a no vote to a yes. Nicaragua, Bolivia, Ecuador switched from abstaining to voting yes. Argentina, Colombia, and El Salvador had voted no. This time they abstained. Under UN rules, abstentions didn't count in determining the 2/3 vote. To the amazement of the Arab world that thought they had it locked up in the United Nations, 29 November 1947, UN General Assembly adopted a resolution recommending the partition of Palestine by 33 votes in favor to 13 against, with 10 abstentions. a majority of 72%. Cuba, the only no vote in the Western Hemisphere. Every single member of Rockefeller's bloc of Latin American nations voted either for Israel or abstained. The vote could not have been obtained without Nelson Rockefeller, but he would not have made those phone calls had it not been made plain to him that it was in his own personal best interests to make those phone calls. David Ben-Gurion had to blackmail the future vice president of the United States, man who served as governor of the state of New York for 14 years, to get the votes to create the state of Israel. But that's not all. Wait, there's more. It is nothing short of miraculous that Israel survived past 1948. Contrary to what conspiracy theorists believe, Israel had to scrape, scrounge, and salvage the weapons they needed to defend themselves. Beginning in the 1920s, when Jack Philby was arming Arab terrorists with British weapons and targeting Jewish settlers, the United States, the United Kingdom, the Soviet Union, basically every nation with a defense industry after World War II refused to sell weapons to Israel. The Arab Legion, however, the army of the state of Jordan, trained and armed by Britain, had what it needed to go to war, which it did on May 14th of 1948. As soon as, in fact, even prior to that, but as soon as Ben-Gurion declared independence, 7 Arab nations went to war with Israel. So, this declaration, May 14th, 1948, the day before the end of the British Mandate, Israel's neighbors turned what had been a civil war against the British into open war against the Jews. And that's where this guy came into play. I see some of you know who Robert Maxwell is. Yeah. He was born Jan Ludwig Hoch, Lev Hoch, Czechoslovakian Jew. Fought against the Nazis, was evacuated to Britain when his unit was about to be overrun. He showed an aptitude for languages, was recruited by MI6, and was deployed into Europe after the war. Now, he saw what was going on with the Jews and the fact that there was no Western help coming for the Jews. And when he saw that, that Israel was facing overwhelming odds in defending itself, he began making a few phone calls to an old buddy of his who had become a prominent member of the Czechoslovakian government. The Czechs had a pretty impressive defense industry. They still got pretty impressive industry to this day. A lot of German war machines were made in Czechoslovakia, including the Messerschmitt Bf 109, one of their top-line fighter planes. Maxwell had found out through MI6 that the British government was planning to overthrow the Czech government because it was socialist, part of the Soviet bloc. And he told his friend, look, here's what's going on. My government wants to overthrow your government. And I'll tell you who the players are and what's going on if you will do me this favor. The Zionists, Ben-Gurion in Tel Aviv, needs weapons. And so the Czechs began packing weapons, including fighter planes, inside big crates labeled farm equipment and things like that, and shipping them into Palestine, where they were very covertly taken off the boats at Haifa, taken into big buildings and reassembled. May 14th, 1948, Ben-Gurion declares independence. They immediately get attacked. The Syrians, the Jordanians, the Egyptians. The Egyptians were rolling a column of armor up the road, the coast road, towards Tel Aviv. They were within about 25 miles of Tel Aviv. The British the Jews did not have tanks. Okay? Egypt is rolling tanks, Soviet tanks, northward, headed for Tel Aviv. They've got an open road. What did the Israelis have? They had 4 Messerschmitt Bf 109s that they had just put back together out of the crates. So they scrambled these 4 fighter planes and sent them to strafe and bomb the Egyptian column. Of the 4 planes that went out, only 1 came back. Ben-Gurion thought it was lost. Surely the Egyptians, we were lost. The dream we had is already gone. However, the Egyptians had not expected the Israelis to have any aircraft. And suddenly, there's planes coming out of the sky, spitting machine gun fire, dropping bombs on them. Oh, the Jews have an air force! They turned around and headed back to Cairo. And that allowed the Israelis to set their defenses and then focus on driving back the Syrians and the Jordanians. Robert Maxwell, who later became a media mogul, he bought the Mirror in the UK? The Mirror Group. He was a shyster. He was a huckster. He basically built an empire on debt. When his role in the founding of Israel came out, MI6 operatives were so upset at him that they went around to his banking contacts in London and said, deny him credit. So when he tried to roll over his debt, suddenly he found that his lines of credit were no longer available. And that's when he went out on his yacht. The official story is that he died of a heart attack and fell off his yacht on his way to the Canary Islands. That's the official story. Whether that's the truth or not, I don't know. But when Israel found out about it, because Ben-Gurion and Israel knew what Robert Maxwell had done, they retrieved his body and gave him a state burial on the Mount of Olives. Because without the weapons provided by the Czechs, who, by the way, his friend in the Czech government, when Stalin found out what he had done, had him arrested and hanged. Robert Maxwell saved Israel in 1948. You've probably heard of his daughter, Ghislaine Maxwell, friend of Jeffrey Epstein. Yeah. So I'm not saying Robert Maxwell was a nice guy, but because he was so angry at what had happened to the Jews in Europe during World War II and the failure of the United Kingdom and the United States to do anything to help, he went outside his own government and got the weapons just enough to save Israel in 1948. One of the events that is often referred to by critics of Israel is the USS Liberty incident in 1967. How can they be our ally? They shot up this boat, this U.S. Navy ship. 34 sailors died, 174 were injured, and this is true. This did happen. This was during the Six-Day War in 1967. Why would an ally attack one of our ships that was plainly flying the American flag? This proves that Israel is not a friend of the United States. What is not known by most is that the USS Liberty was a very high-tech signals intercept surveillance espionage vessel, one of the most advanced signal intercept platforms on planet Earth, and it had been commandeered by the National Security Agency. President Lyndon Johnson had dispatched the boat to try to curry favor with the Arabs. The USS Liberty was intercepting Israeli military communications during the Six-Day War. It was 12 miles off the coast of Gaza. Apparently, the equipment on the USS Liberty was so sensitive it could pick up handheld walkie-talkie communications. And with this information could develop what's called an order of battle, meaning they could develop a very precise map showing exactly where all Israeli military units in the Negev, the southern part, and the Sinai Peninsula were located, which is where Israel was fighting the Egyptian forces at the time. Now, Israel was fighting a three-front war: Egypt in the south, Jordan in the east, Syria in the north. And the IDF, the Israel Defense Force, was preparing to pull units from the Sinai and dispatch them to the north to take the Golan Heights away from Syria. Why? Military. How important is holding the high ground? Very important. The Golan Heights overlooks the Sea of Galilee, and the Israelis had suffered 20 years of having their communities around the Sea of Galilee, like Tiberias, being shelled by mortars from the Syrian side. The world still says it belongs to Syria. I'm sorry, Syria is never getting the Golan Heights back. Israel will never let that happen. But to take it from Syria, the Israelis had to pull troops from the Sinai. And if, as was happening according to the interviews conducted by the authors of Secret War Against the Jews, the Liberty was sending the signals intelligence to a relay station on the island of Cyprus and then turning around and sending it to Nasser, the leader of Egypt, so that the Egyptians would know exactly where the holes would develop in the Israeli line as they pulled troops and units away to send them north. This would have been devastating for the Israelis. So yes, they knew this was an American vessel, but they also knew what this American ship was doing. They could have sunk the ship. I'm not saying that it... I think the tragedy here is that you had 174 wounded and 34 killed because Johnson and the NSA decided to spy for the Arabs against Israel. And critics want to say, Israel has never treated us like an ally. USS Liberty, yeah, we were spying for the enemies of Israel in the Six-Day War. Israel made it clear, you need to stop this now. And suddenly, the intelligence that Nasser had expected to get was cut off. He didn't know which units were being withdrawn from the Negev, from the Sinai rather. And Israel did in fact take the Golan Heights away from Syria. This would have been a disaster for Israel. This is why Israel attacked the USS Liberty. When anybody brings this up, just say, hey, look, we were spying for the Egyptians. And Israel would have been overrun if they had not shut down what the USS Liberty was doing. But the National Security Agency wanted to get even. So in 1973, when the Yom Kippur War broke out, the NSA knew that the Egyptians were planning to attack, but they waited until 4 hours before the scheduled attack to let Israel know about it. Oh, hey, so we almost forgot to call. Well, of course, by this time, Israel's got a very unique process for calling up reserves. They basically get on the phone and all the reserves that you call up, find your way to your unit by any means necessary. Private vehicles, hitchhike, get on a bike, whatever. Get to where you need to get to as fast as you can get there. But it usually takes like 8 or 9 hours for these guys to actually make it in full force. So with 4 hours, the Israelis were really put in a bind. Because by the time Egypt attacked, the Israelis were still not at full strength. And Egypt crossed over into the Negev and were driving the Israelis back. Now, most people, my age anyway, if you're old, you young man wouldn't remember this. Alexander Haig, we remember when Reagan got shot, that Secretary of State Haig said, I'm in command here in the White House, I'm in control. Like, well, that's weird because Secretary of State's not in the chain of command here, chain of succession. It's not you, it's like the Speaker of the House, and then, anyway. That's what I remembered about Alexander Haig back in 83, I guess. What's not known is that when he was in Richard Nixon's White House, he was the chief of staff for President Nixon in 1973. And Alexander Haig saved Israel from being overrun. At the time, Henry Kissinger was the Secretary of State. And Kissinger, who was a diplomat, but he was not a military man, he wanted the Israelis to get a bloody nose, as he put it. So he wanted to let the Arabs win for a little bit, then we'll come in, we'll give them a little help, and that way they'll be a little more grateful for us, whatever it was. He thought it was really a good idea to let the Israelis get a bloody nose. Haig was a military man. He served in World War II with General Douglas MacArthur. He knew logistics and supply chain. He knew that if we didn't get weapons to the Israelis right now, the war would be over and Israel would be destroyed. So, without telling Nixon or Kissinger, Alexander Haig, who was chief of staff of the White House, not in the military anymore, made a phone call to a contact in the IDF and a contact in the CIA. Said, look, there's going to be a CIA plane at Ben Gurion Airport in the next 4 hours. Get a bunch of guys who we can train on this new weapon that we've got. Put them on that plane. And we've got something we think can help you win this war. He was talking about the TOW missile, the anti-tank missile, which had just been developed. Nobody had it but the United States. This was a missile that is fired and it trails out a copper wire for a couple of kilometers. And basically, as long as you keep the tank in the crosshairs, the missile would follow where it was going to go. It changed the game when it came to armored warfare because suddenly the kill rate on tanks was over 90% when you fired these missiles. Nobody else had it. Certainly the Egyptians weren't expecting the Israelis to have it. They didn't even know about it. It was a secret. This was America's secret. The only places we had these were in the east coast of the United States and some at bases in Germany against a possible Russian invasion. So Haig gets a bunch of Israeli soldiers on a plane, a CIA plane. And this was great. One of the authors of that book, The Secret War Against the Jews, John Loftus, was duty officer at Fort Benning in Georgia. And his commander says, okay, John, I got a weird thing coming in tonight. We got a CIA plane with a bunch of Israelis going to land here. You are to take them into that hangar. Don't let anybody see them. They're going to be here for a few days. Don't tell anybody. So the Israelis come over. They spend a few days learning how to fire the TOW missile, while Alexander Haig is, without the knowledge of his bosses, scraping up every TOW missile that he can find on the East Coast and in Germany and shipping them to Israel. So just as the Egyptians are getting ready to push through with their tank columns, basically trying to take command of a key pass in the Negev that would have allowed them to basically sweep into Israel. It would have been lights out for Israel. Suddenly their tanks start blowing up in the desert. And the Egyptians can't figure out why. There's no planes. What? Boom, boom. Because Alexander Haig had provided the weapons and the training on this secret weapon without the knowledge of the President of the United States and the Secretary of State, who had wanted to let the Israelis bleed a little. If he had not done so, Israel would have fallen in 1973. In fact, it was so dire in 73 that the Minister of Defense, Moshe Dayan, told Prime Minister Golda Meir, it's lost. There's a story that Golda Meir's good friend, a woman, was making preparations for the two of them to commit suicide because they saw the end of the Jewish dream in Israel. 25 years after its founding in 1948, they thought 1973, this is it. And Alexander Haig delivered the missiles, the anti-tank weapons that allowed Israel to withstand the attack in the Yom Kippur War. Getting close to the end here. Who was not involved in the creation of the Jewish state and its survival past 1948, 1967, 1973? Well, the Khazarians, the Rothschilds, the Freemasons, the Illuminati, the Vatican, the Elders of Zion. I'm sorry. These things are all conspiracy theories by people who want to find reasons to justify hating Israel and the people of Israel. Yes, this is the real Israel. Events have moved to push the Jews toward Palestine. Think about this. Had anti-Semitism not risen up in Europe and in Russia and in the United States in the 19th century, Jews would have been happy to stay where they were. We're settled, we've got a home, we've got a business. Suddenly they realized, look, we have to leave or we're all going to die. In the 20th century, if it had not been for the rise of Hitler, of Ibn Saud, of Stalin, making it clear that Jews needed to come together to defend themselves, they might have been content to stay where they were. Let's face it, most of us don't do what needs doing unless it's absolutely necessary. I am that object at rest that tends to remain at rest. But the need to pay the mortgage motivates me to actually, do some work from time to time. But on a broader sense, if we were facing extermination, Would you cross the ocean to save your family? Would you move to a new land, not knowing what you'd find on the other side? My German ancestors came here in the 1890s to North Dakota to get away from Russian persecution. I'm sure it wasn't as bad as what the Jews experienced, but their young men were being conscripted into the Russian army. They got on boats and came over here with nothing in their pockets, really, had it not been made absolutely necessary. Yes, there would have been an Israel at some point. God promised it, and it has happened. God has always used flawed men and women to achieve his ends. Abraham, lack of faith led to the birth of Ishmael. And we see what problem that's caused in the Arab-Israeli relations over the last century. David had a man killed to cover up his adultery. Peter saw Jesus walk on the water, and yet when he was under pressure, denied that he even knew him. And yet God used these men. Paul, who led the death squads to exterminate early Christians, later became the apostle to the Gentiles. Even pagans used to save his people. Nebuchadnezzar. God called Nebuchadnezzar, this pagan polytheist king who at one point demanded worship, God called Nebuchadnezzar my servant. Cyrus the Great. Yes, he returned the Jews to Jerusalem, but when you read historian accounts of what Cyrus was actually doing, the last king of Babylon, Nabonidus, brought the idols of all the gods of Mesopotamia into Babylon because he thought he was protecting Babylon. I've got all the gods of Mesopotamia here. The Persians will never get in. Well, didn't work out. But the people of Mesopotamia then thought their cities were unprotected because our God is now in Babylon. Cyrus sent the gods back to their cities. In his mind, he was just sending Yahweh back to Jerusalem. But it doesn't change the fact that he told Isaiah that he would do it a couple of centuries before it happened. God uses people who are not Jews and not Christians to achieve his ends. And most importantly, God is not done with Israel. Romans 11, beginning at verse 1. I ask then, has God rejected his people? By no means, for I myself am an Israelite, a descendant of Abraham, a member of the tribe of Benjamin. God has not rejected his people whom he foreknew. Do you not know what the scripture says of Elijah, how he appeals to God against Israel? Lord, they have killed your prophets. They have demolished your altars, and I alone am left, and they seek my life. But what is God's reply? I have kept for myself 7,000 men who have not bowed the knee to Baal. So too at the present time there is a remnant chosen by grace. Paul wrote this 20 years after Pentecost, which scholars agree was the date from which we found the beginning of the Christian church. Paul saying, God's not done with Israel. And we see this in the future. The day of the Lord, Zechariah 12, where God says that a day is coming, the day of the Lord, Armageddon, where the house of Judah, the house of David, will be in Jerusalem. And he says, and I will pour out on the house of David and the inhabitants of Jerusalem a spirit of grace and pleas for mercy, so that when they look on me, God speaking, when they look on me, on him whom they have pierced, they shall mourn for him as one mourns for an only child, and weep bitterly over him as one weeps over a firstborn. God is not done with Israel. And a day is coming when they will look on him and say, what have we done? But God will pour out in them his mercy. So until that day, we pray for the peace of Jerusalem. We pray for our brothers and sisters in Israel to see him as we see him. We plant those seeds and pray for them to come to fruition. Israel is the real Israel. There's a phrase that we heard a lot when we were over there back in the spring. Am Yisrael Chai. The people of Israel live. Thank you. Thank you.
This really explains how we can have faith, how God will step in at the last minute, do what he does to save Israel. And that is, I had no idea.
It's happened again and again.
Yeah.
We see the miraculous events of the Bible where Israel was saved, but we see it again in the 20th century. I had no idea about Robert Maxwell and his role to deliver the weapons that they needed to hold off the attacks in 1948. Had no idea about the USS Liberty or about Alexander Haig in 1973. How close Israel was to destruction in 48 and 73 especially. And to our shame as Americans, the role of powerful men and women inside the United States, bankers, industrialists, oil men, beginning in the 1930s, to try to prevent the creation of Israel and to try to crush Israel after its founding. Because just like the criticism of George W. Bush in the first Gulf War, it's all about the oil. Well, guess what? That summarizes American relations with Israel for the last 75 years. It's all about the oil, and Israel doesn't have any. So,
Yeah, Derek, just great presentation. Another good presentation.
Thank you.
I just appreciate that. I just want to feel like this needs to be said. You know, I've always been pretty conservative, like yourself. I know, Derek, and but we have to be really, really careful nowadays. As I'm sure most of you know. I'm going to say this out loud. I'm going to pick on somebody, Tucker Carlson. I used
Yep.
to be a big fan of Tucker's. I think that Tucker, you know, he's did a lot of good things, but he's been having some people on the program lately that seems to be giving a green light to Hitler. And I don't know if Tucker's trying to find himself or what's going on with Tuck, but I won't listen to him no more. I'm done. That's me.
well, you need to discern, and Tucker Carlson has definitely had some people on, not just with that, but he had a Lutheran pastor from Bethlehem, an Arab Lutheran pastor.
Another good example.
Yeah, who gave a sermon on October 8th last year, where he basically said, well, what do you expect? The Israelis have been doing this to our people for... It's like, really? So, yeah, it's... According to people who worked with him inside Fox News, Tucker's opinions of Israel were pretty well known behind the scenes, but when he was working at Fox, he was not allowed to say things that he can now say that he's working for himself. Candace Owens is another, she's not as... Let me put it this way. She's better when she is working for somebody who gives her guidelines. Because she has promoted a number of theories that are just not only ahistorical, meaning there's no historical basis for it, like the idea of a group called the Frankists, who are an evil cabal that control all of our governments and control entertainment and control whatever. I'm sorry, there was a guy who led a cult back in the 19th century named Jacob Frank. He died actually at the end of the 18th century. His daughter died in 1815, and his cult disappeared after that. So for her to say that, well, I won't even get into it because it's really ridiculous. There's no historic basis there. There's even less historical basis for that than there is for the Khazarian theory. But there are people out there who want to find reasons to hate the Jews. And look, there are people who might even look at what I just presented and say, well, see, David Ben-Gurion was actually working against the United States because he knew of intelligence agents who were inside the U.S. feeding information to Stalin. And, yeah, but the United States, bankers, oil men, industrialists were actively working with the Arabs and with the Germans to try to prevent and to try to kill Jews. And when the Jews had an opportunity to get free, the U.S. and the U.K. said, no, we do not want to cooperate with Germany to try to we don't want them here either. And it is a black mark on the history of this country. And for Americans to try to play high and mighty and say, well, look, they've not treated us like allies. Well, we haven't treated them like allies either. Our friends in Israel, Orthodox Jews, tell us that American Christians, conservative American Christians, are not just Israel's best friends in the world. We are their only friends in the world. But we don't control the American government. There are very prominent, very powerful forces inside the U.S. who have no love for Israel or for the Jews. Is that a supernatural, is there a supernatural influence there? Probably. But what we can say is, what has been historically documented. And we have not been consistently on the side of the Zionists in Israel. Again, as you go through this history, you recognize that the names that keep being brought up, well, the Rothschilds paid for Israel. Well, no, I'm sorry, they didn't. When you actually look at the Rothschild banking family, most of them were happy continuing their wealthy lives in Europe. You had Edmund, who financed a couple of communities, Walter, Lord Rothschild, who received the Balfour Declaration, and there were some donations later, like the Knesset and the Supreme Court building were constructed with money from Rothschilds. But that was well after Israel was founded as a nation. The Rothschilds had very, very little to do with the creation of Israel. Robert Maxwell had more to do with Israel making it as a nation. David Ben-Gurion, Richard Cowder, that intelligence officer, a Jewish intelligence officer working for the Nazis, who realized, okay, the Nazis are not our friends, but the Americans clearly aren't helping us either. The only ones I can trust are other Zionists, like Ben-Gurion. We haven't given them reason to really trust us. So, and I will say this again, the criticism of Benjamin Netanyahu, where people have said, well, he allowed it to happen. The IDF and the Mossad, they are so powerful that they must have allowed this to happen. Okay, Mossad and IDF, not as all-powerful as most people like to think. Secondly, you got to be socialists to make it to the upper ranks of those organizations, and they don't like Netanyahu or the conservatives. Again, you got 20% socialists there controlling the 60% of conservative religious Jews who would like to be closer aligned with the United States. But these guys in the IDF, who had a higher opinion of their own abilities than was warranted, oh yes, Hamas is totally deterred. They wouldn't dare attack us. And we better not tell Netanyahu anything differently, because we don't want him to know. At the very worst, at the very least, it was incompetence by the IDF and Mossad. At the worst, they deliberately didn't tell him what they knew, because there is evidence that IDF intelligence knew that Hamas was planning something. But there's no guarantee that they told Netanyahu. Just as the Pentagon admits that they weren't telling Trump everything that they thought, things that he didn't need to know because we think he's a threat to national security. The Israelis are dealing with the same situation with Netanyahu. So, yes, sir.
A couple quick things on that. I've heard Tucker Carlson, little red string bracelet he wears, symbolizes something, his loyalties. I don't know if that's true or not, but that's supposedly Freemason. So anyway, but just interesting stuff. I don't know if I got my information right, but Forrestal, didn't he also found the Majestic 12? Or was one of that was appointed to?
I don't know. I've not done a lot of, I think Majestic 12 was the early 50s, and I think Forrestal had committed suicide by then.
Had he committed suicide by then?
I'd have to go back and look. I'm not sure.
Because I know he, and he was like a mentor of JFK. There's pictures of them together.
Hmm.
He was a, and then JFK, I mean, you start looking at what you talked about there. Forrestal was deep into the deep state, and then it was somehow mentored JFK, and JFK came out and basically said there are powers and forces that you have no idea about, kind of referring to deep state.
Yeah.
And within a few days,
Yeah.
he was done. So, I mean, it's just kind of, you sit there and look at all this, right, and you're like, I don't know.
I know. You start diving into this and you realize how little control American presidents actually have, where Roosevelt, Truman, Eisenhower, Reagan, Nixon, they didn't have complete control over what was happening in their own.
Wilson talked about that.
Yeah. Carter, who was naive, thought that he was doing good things for peace and was in fact giving away Israeli intelligence to the Arabs as a peace offering. And by the way, Jonathan Pollard, he's another name that comes up a lot by critics of Israel. Jonathan Pollard, who supposedly gave away the store as far as American intelligence to Israel. Pollard, according to the guys who were interviewed for that book, The Secret War Against the Jews, he basically was an amateur who was in way over his head. He was an enthusiastic amateur. The real reason that Jonathan Pollard was arrested and put in jail by the United States government was that he inadvertently stumbled onto the illicit arms shipments that were part of the Iran-Contra deal, and he was threatening to blow that sky high. So when they found out that he had slipped that information back to his handler, and he was not Mossad, by the way. He was being run by some conservative politicians in Israel who wanted to get information that was not being filtered through the socialists in the Mossad. They didn't know what they were doing. Pollard didn't know what he was doing. He didn't know what information he had when he found these arms shipments. And suddenly, Vice President George Herbert Walker Bush and William Casey, the CIA director, they were panicked because the information was about to get. So Pollard went. The Mossad didn't want him because they thought he was an embarrassment. He might reveal other information that we don't want him to tell. So that's why it took so long for Israel to take him back. Mossad didn't want him. American didn't want him talking to anybody. It was, there's a lot going on that is not according to the official narrative. I think one thing we can be sure of is that whatever the story is, the official story, whatever the event is, the official story is almost always wrong.
Paul's testimony of his time in the U.S. prison system is pretty damning on the United States. I mean, he says they put him in solitary for
Yep.
7 years and tried to kill him. I mean, that's pretty severe.
It is. But again, you were about to expose the activities, illegal activities of very powerful men inside the highest levels of the American government. And the tragedy of the whole Iran-Contra thing is that they were trying to find a way to bribe Syrian intelligence officers who kidnapped a CIA operative in the Middle East. And they found out after the fact that the guy that they were dealing with in Syria was actually working on behalf of the guys who kidnapped him. So while they were working this all out and sending weapons to Iran and trying to cover it up, and Oliver North was doing his thing and all of that, the CIA agent who had been kidnapped was already dead. So, yeah. George H.W. Bush was not as good a CIA director as it's been led to believe. Yes, sir.
I'd always heard that Golda Meir in the Yom Kippur War, that she had called Nixon, and then, you hear this story about Nixon's mother. Was that ever, that if he ever had a chance in his lifetime to help Israel, he should do it? Is
That's an official story. Nixon and Kissinger came out of that looking a lot better like the saviors of Israel. But the fact is that it was Alexander Haig behind the scenes.
So that was kind of made up afterwards?
Sure. They couldn't tell the real story. That Haig working outside the chain of command without Nixon or Kissinger, because if Kissinger and Nixon's orders had been followed, Israel would have been overrun by the time American aid got to Israel. Yes, sir.
Yeah, you mentioned the Vatican rat lines. Actually, back when the mainstream media was sort of good, Sam Donaldson did a really good documentary on that back in 1994, I believe. And you can still watch it. It's called The Vatican Rat Lines. And it's kind of basic.
Yeah.
But it was actually pretty good.
But the Vatican was only one player in that. It was really set up by Alan Dulles and then an American operative named James Jesus Angleton. And in fact, and this is something I, again, couldn't even fit in here because I've already went for 2 hours with just what I had. But Angleton was blackmailed by Ben-Gurion and basically said, okay, look, we'll keep your secret as far as your involvement in the rat lines as long as you keep spying for the Mossad when you're back at CIA headquarters. So Angleton, when he went back to CIA, was in charge of finding the Russian moles, but he couldn't because that would mean outing the Zionist moles working for the KGB. And yeah, it's like basically you got to continue helping Stalin or we're going to tell everybody how you helped the Nazis. And this is partly why 98% of the American intelligence assets behind the Iron Curtain in the 50s were, yeah,